The first scream came from inside the violin case before Emma Vale touched the brass latch. Lucas Reed said, "Do you hear that wire singing?" The sound was sharp and brittle, a scraping of teeth along glass. Emma's hands trembled as she unfastened the clasps. Inside, the strings lay slack, except one that coiled tight, thin as a snare. Father Gabriel Moore had warned them never to open it. Emma said, "It belonged to my mother, and silence is worse." The lone string hissed, stretching as if it breathed. Lucas reached forward, glove brushing the filament, then hissed in pain as it sliced leather clean. He said, "That is no gut, that is hair." The case smelled of iron and rot, and the bow rattled by itself, tapping a hollow rhythm. Emma whispered, "If there is a will, it dies with me." The string snapped across her wrist with a cut so fine it looked drawn in ink. Lucas pressed cloth hard against the wound. The violin gave a low hum that filled the parlor like grief. Somewhere deep in the hall, a child's laugh echoed once, then collapsed into silence. The air stilled, and the house braced itself for what followed. Morning arrived, gray and breathless, storm still clinging to the walls. Karen Holt entered with a metal case and a smile that cut. She said, "Strings cannot move by themselves." Emma Vale wrapped her wrist in cloth and stayed silent. Lucas Reed poured bitter coffee that smelled of pennies. Father Gabriel Moore traced the violin's rim with 2 fingers before withdrawing. Emma said, "My mother played it until she died." Karen smirked, setting a spectrometer on the table. She said, "We will prove friction and fear." The deepest string plucked itself a sharp twang. Karen looked up quickly, then forced a shrug. Emma felt the parlor tilt, gravity bending toward the case. Lucas said, "It wants attention." Father Gabriel whispered prayer beneath his breath, the words dust dry. The lamp dimmed until its glow resembled a bruise. The air pressed down, heavy as stone, waiting for more blood. Karen clipped a sensor to the bridge, recording the baseline hum. She said, "Subsonic resonance, nothing more." Emma Vale fixed her gaze on the hair string that curved like a living vein. Lucas Reed said, "Storm is gone." Father Gabriel Moore poured salt in a ring, muttering, "It remembers hands that bled." Karen rolled her eyes but kept working. The hum sharpened, vibrating against teeth. Emma said, "It followed my mother from the conservatory to hospice." The bow twitched and knocked the rosin. Karen said, "Static discharge." The lamp blinked out with a hiss, shadows swallowing the room. The violin whispered a name too clear, echoing in Emma's ears. Her shoulders locked, lips pressed thin. Lucas leaned forward, face pale, ears straining. Father Gabriel clutched his rosary tighter. The name repeated once, as if waiting for Emma to answer. The violin was shifted to the dining table, floor groaning beneath the weight. Lucas Reed asked, "If we cut the strings, will it stop?" Father Gabriel Moore shook his head. He said, "It feeds." Karen Holt pulled sterile shears from her kit, holding them like a challenge. She said, "Or it ends a superstition." Emma Vale touched the chin rest, feeling warmth rise through the wood like breath. She said, "It is not finished speaking." The hair string stretched, humming against the fingerboard. Karen raised the shears, knuckles tense. Lucas said, "Do it fast." Curtains stirred inward, though no wind blew, as if the house drew in air. Father Gabriel lowered his eyes, whispering words no one could hear. The room darkened, the table shaking faintly as if alive. Karen Holt closed the shears on the filament. Metal kissed hair with a bright ping that sounded like laughter. The blades slid aside as if coated in oil. She said, "Impossible." The string snapped taut and sang a thin note. Lucas Reed gripped the neck to steady it. Father Gabriel Moore said, "Do not hold, it will answer." Emma Vale placed her palm near the bridge and felt it pulse like a throat. She said, "This is a voice." The violin whispered the name again, sharper. The room tilted toward the case. Karen's jaw tightened as she cut once more. Light flickered, and the string split, then remove in an instant. It lashed across Lucas's sleeve, leaving a charred seam. He said, "It wants skin." The parlor held still, listening for the next attempt, silence weighing heavier than the storm outside. The storm thinned to a sheen, but the house kept its hush. Emma Vale wiped dried blood from her wrist and stared at the violin like it might blink. Lucas Reed said, "You do not have to keep it here." She said, "It was my mother's voice." Father Gabriel Moore stood near the doorway, gaze lowered. He said, "Voices can be borrowed." Karen Holt checked her gear and smiled without warmth. She said, "Grief can tune a room." Emma traced the case seam and remembered recitals and hospital halls. The hair string had sung across both. Lucas said, "We can move it to my studio." The floorboard popped as if in answer. Emma said, "It follows the name on the label." Father Gabriel whispered that names bind as surely as knots. The violin gave a breath of sound, soft as silk on bone. Karen noted the frequency and raised an eyebrow that dared them to be afraid. The envelope waited in a drawer, brittle and heavy with legal ink. Emma Vale unfolded the will and found one line underlined twice. It granted the violin and warned never to restring it. Lucas Reed said, "Your mother knew." Emma said, "She played through the whispers." Karen Holt scanned the page and scoffed at superstition. She said, "A luthier note, nothing more." Father Gabriel Moore took a breath and asked for the maker's name. Emma read the label aloud, and the room cooled at once. Lucas looked at the window and saw his breath fog. Father Gabriel said, "The hair belonged to someone wronged." Karen called it folklore and wrote a timestamp. The deepest string thrummed once from the closed case. Emma folded the will with hands that would not steady. They cleared a space in the studio and set 4 mics around the table. Lucas Reed said, "We document everything." Emma Vale nodded and placed chalk marks on the floor. Father Gabriel Moore poured a thin ring of salt and paused at the corners. He said, "Corners keep secrets." Karen Holt checked power and calibrated sensors. She said, "If it moves, we will see it." The hair string answered with a faint tremor under the lid. Emma flinched, then steadied and pressed record. Lucas said, "We stand together on this." She said, "We finish what my mother began." The room vibrated like an empty throat clearing. Father Gabriel set a small candle and shielded the flame with his palm. Karen rolled her eyes but did not blow it out. Karen Holt lifted the lid slowly and pointed to the gauges. She said, "No magnetic anomaly." The bow slid a finger's width by itself and tapped the rosin. Emma Vale said, "It answers when the name is spoken." Lucas Reed whispered the maker's name, and the tap quickened. Karen forced a laugh and called it airflow. Father Gabriel Moore said the windows were shut. The candle pulled sideways and then stood straight. The hair string tightened a notch and sang under breath. Emma stepped back, pulse skittering. Lucas moved closer, jaw set. Karen said, "Confirmation bias." The meters climbed anyway. The room listened like a patient hunter, and silence sharpened all the edges. Father Gabriel Moore asked for 1 minute without instruments or speech. He walked the room and pressed his palm to the plaster. He said, "Walls carry confessions." Emma Vale watched his face harden. Lucas Reed said, "What do you feel?" Father Gabriel said, "A braid of voices tugging." Karen Holt folded her arms and called it suggestion. Emma opened the case and stared at the label again. The letters seemed deeper, as if carved into wet wood. She said her mother's name, and the note glowed in the air like a thin thread of heat. Lucas said, "Tell it to stop." Father Gabriel said, "It will not obey, but it will bargain." Karen clicked her pen and told the recorder to mark the time. The hair string lifted the bow a breath's height and held it there waiting. Night pressed in heavy and damp, the studio's walls groaning as if alive. Emma Vale traced the chalk ring with anxious steps. Lucas Reed said, "We should burn it now." Father Gabriel Moore said, "Fire will not silence hair." Karen Holt adjusted her sensor and smirked. She said, "You hear vibrations, nothing more." The violin's bridge quivered, bow lifting on its own, trembling like a hand unsure of violence. Emma said, "It waits for a name." Lucas whispered, "Do not say it again." The bow struck a single harsh note, loud enough to rattle the windows. Father Gabriel whispered, "It learns faster each night." Karen tried to log the sound, but her tablet screen flickered and died. Emma held her bandaged wrist, feeling the pulse answer the string. The house seemed to lean closer, listening with invisible ears. Emma Vale tried to close the case, but the lid pushed back against her palm. She said, "It does not want to rest." Lucas Reed grabbed the latch, straining, but the hinge screamed and popped open again. Father Gabriel Moore said, "It feeds on refusal." Karen Holt snapped, "Wood warps, hinges stick." The hairstrings stretched and whispered a note that shivered like breath down their necks. Emma backed away, clutching her wrist. Lucas said, "It cut her once, it will cut again." The candle guttered sideways though the windows stayed shut. Karen tapped the case with her pen, daring it to move. The violin sang one long low vibration that buzzed against the bones of their teeth. Emma whispered, "It remembers." The room smelled of iron, sharp and sour, as silence returned. The bow jerked upward and struck across the strings without a hand. A shrill scream filled the studio, cutting through the candle flame. Emma Vale clapped her hands to her ears, eyes wide. Lucas Reed shouted, "Stop it!" Father Gabriel Moore pressed salt into the chalk circle, voice shaking. He said, "It cannot cross unless invited." Karen Holt laughed nervously and said, "Air pressure triggers resonance." The violin snapped another note that shattered a picture frame on the wall. Glass scattered across the salt ring. Emma said, "It breaks what binds." Lucas pushed her behind him, jaw clenched. Father Gabriel whispered a prayer louder, his voice rising above the shriek. Karen froze when her senses spiked to blank red. The bow dropped flat, silence falling like a blow to the chest. Lucas Reed pulled Emma Vale toward the door, but the knob rattled without turning. He said, "It locked us in." Emma pressed her forehead to the wood, whispering her mother's name, and the knob froze cold beneath her skin. Father Gabriel Moore said, "The hair was taken from the condemned." Karen Holt rolled her eyes, but her lips tightened. She said, "Then find me proof." The violin hummed the same name Emma had whispered, each note closer to her voice. Lucas struck the table shouting, "Enough!" The string snapped upward and sliced the edge of his sleeve again. Father Gabriel raised the candle and said, "It knows blood." Emma turned pale and shaking and said, "It wants to finish what my mother began." Karen typed furiously, though her hands trembled. The hum swelled into silence that crushed the air. The string twisted itself tighter until wood cracked faintly. Emma Vale said, "It is pulling toward me." Lucas Reed stepped forward and gripped her shoulders. He said, "Then we end it together." Father Gabriel Moore shouted a litany, beads rattling as he clenched the rosary. Karen Holt recorded every sound, though her eyes darted wide. The bow rose again, faster, and lashed across the strings, striking a chord that made the floorboards heave. Emma gasped and clutched her chest, feeling the note burn through her ribs. Lucas dragged her back, but the sound chased them, vibrating through the walls. Father Gabriel dropped to his knees, voice breaking as he shouted, "It knows her bloodline." Emma whispered, "It does not want me free." The string gave a final hiss and stilled, leaving the silence sharper than any scream. The house settled into uneasy silence, but Father Gabriel Moore finally spoke of the curse. He said, "The violin was strung with the hair of prisoners executed unjustly." Emma Vale felt her chest tighten, whispering, "My mother played their voices." Lucas Reed clenched his fists, saying, "Then it sings with blood." Karen Holt raised her recorder and said, "Every folktale starts with a crime." The candle shook on its plate, though no one touched it. Father Gabriel said, "It was bound to a lineage, not an object." Emma looked at her wrist and said, "Then it was bound to me." Lucas moved closer, protective and restless. Karen scoffed. "Science will prove hysteria." The violin thrummed, one low tone vibrating like a vein beneath skin, as if agreeing only with Emma. Father Gabriel Moore walked a slow circle, voice low. He said, "The Maker wove the condemned into the music to curse their accusers." Emma Vale said, "My mother did not accuse." Lucas Reed whispered, "She inherited." Karen Holt frowned at the words, but her hand shook as she wrote them down. Emma stared at the strings, lips trembling. Father Gabriel said, "It sings until the family is emptied." Lucas said, "Then it will not stop." Karen lifted her camera and said, "Then we record the end." The violin gave a dry hiss, hair string tightening with slow menace. The candle flame split into two thin tongues, burning without heat. Emma whispered, "It waits for another to play." Karen Holt leaned forward, voice sharp. She said, "If it needs a player, let it prove itself." She reached for the bow, but Lucas Reed caught her wrist. He said, "Do not touch it." Emma Vale shouted, "Stop!" The bow jerked free and landed across the strings, dragging a note too human in its cry. Father Gabriel Moore flinched, pressing his rosary to his lips. He said, "Every note steals breath." Karen pulled back with wide eyes, muttering, "That sound was not wood." Emma staggered, covering her ears, but still hearing it inside her chest. Lucas slammed the lid, but the hinges rattled open again. The violin sang a second time, higher, crueler, as if demanding more. The bow dropped to the floor with a hollow clatter, but the note still lingered, vibrating in bone. Emma Vale said, "It plays without touch." Lucas Reed shook his head, whispering, "This is no instrument, it is a throat." Karen Holt muttered, "The resonance matches a human scream." Father Gabriel Moore raised his candle higher. He said, "Each strand is the voice of the dead." The flame bent toward Emma, as if reaching for her. She stepped back, face drained, saying, "It chose me." Lucas said, "Then we cut it loose." The violin twanged hard, shaking the table, strings straining like tendons. Karen stared, muttering, "That is impossible." Father Gabriel whispered, "It is justice that never sleeps." The walls groaned, and plaster cracked as the sound grew. Emma Vale pressed both hands to her chest, whispering, "It will not stop." Lucas Reed grabbed the case, trying to hurl it across the room. The violin clung to the table as if nailed by unseen force. Father Gabriel Moore said, "It anchors to the blood." Karen Holt scrambled to document, but the camera sputtered and failed. The candle extinguished, plunging them into stormlight through the window. The string tightened one more time and lashed outward, slicing the curtain clean in two. Emma screamed, "It wants a player." Lucas shouted, "Then we will not give it one." Father Gabriel prayed louder, but the violin hummed like laughter, a sound too cold to belong in the world. The storm dragged shadows across the parlor as Emma Vale bent over the violin's label, the ink deeper than before. She whispered, "This is my family's name." Lucas Reed said, "It tied itself to blood." Father Gabriel Moore gripped his rosary tighter, saying, "The curse was never random, it chose its heirs." Karen Holt muttered, "Inheritance is not proof." Emma pressed her palm to the strings and felt them pulse against her skin like veins. Lucas pulled her back, shouting, "It wants you to play." She said, "My mother obeyed it. I never will." The violin's strings tightened until wood groaned, and one snapped with a sound like bone breaking. Father Gabriel whispered, "It has been waiting for this confession." Karen's recorder failed with a hollow click, and silence pressed thick, waiting for the next word. Emma Vale dropped the bow, but the hair strings coiled around it like snakes. She gasped, "It refuses to let go." Lucas Reed tried to pry them loose, his knuckles white with strain. Father Gabriel Moore shouted, "Every strand belongs to the condemned." Karen Holt said, "Then cut them all." Lucas pulled harder, but the bough lashed free, slicing across his forearm, leaving a thin scarlet line. He cursed, clutching the wound. Emma cried, "It feeds on us." Father Gabriel poured salt across the table, but the grains scattered, as if pushed away. Karen's eyes widened as the bough rattled upright by itself, trembling like a living hand. The violin screamed a note that bent the window glass. Emma whispered, "It wants a player's blood to finish the song." Lucas Reed clutched his arm as Emma Vale tried to bind it with cloth. He said, "It takes piece by piece." Father Gabriel Moore said, "It will not end until the bloodline pays." Emma shook her head and said, "It will not claim me." Karen Holt raised her camera and whispered, "The data will prove the impossible." The violin throbbed louder, wood creaking, hairstrings glowing faintly in the lamplight. Emma's reflection rippled in its polished surface, her lips moving without sound. Lucas pulled her back, shouting, "It is inside you." Father Gabriel struck the floor with his cane, shouting prayers. Karen dropped her pen when the candle flared green. The violin whispered her mother's name again, this time through Emma's own voice, leaving her shaking and pale. The violin strings snapped taut, bow lifting high as if preparing for a final strike. Emma Vale fell to her knees, gasping, "It wants me to finish the song." Lucas Reed shouted, "We break it now." He lunged with the shears, but the blades bent like tin. Karen Holt said, "Metal cannot cut human hair bound in blood." Father Gabriel Moore cried out, "Then fire must test it." He lit a scrap of cloth, holding it near the strings. The violin shrieked, a scream so human it froze them. Emma sobbed. It was my mother's voice. The flame died in a rush of cold wind, leaving smoke curling in the dark. Lucas threw the useless shears against the wall. The bow twitched and pointed at Emma like an accusing finger. Ah! The violin struck one final note, violent enough to rattle the floorboards. Emma Vale clutched her chest, whispering, "It is inside me now." Lucas Reed pulled her close, shouting, "We fight it together." Father Gabriel Moore fell back into his chair, face gray, saying, "The curse chose her at birth." Karen Holt's recorder sparked and went dark, the sound swallowing even the storm outside. The strings lashed outward, slicing the air, leaving marks on plaster. Emma's lips moved with words not her own, a chant too old for language. Lucas shouted her name, shaking her, but she only whispered the same name the violin had sung since the beginning. Father Gabriel covered his face, saying, "It is no longer the violin, it is her." The bow dropped flat, silence heavier than stone. The parlor shook, as if a storm lived inside the walls. Emma Vale staggered, the strings wrapping her wrist like living wire. Lucas Reed shouted, "It is binding her." Father Gabriel Moore said, "The curse feeds fully now." Karen Holt lifted her recorder, but it sparked and died in her hands. The violin glowed faintly, its bow levitating again, trembling with hunger. Emma screamed, "It is burning me." Lucas tried to tear the strings away, but they lashed at his palms, drawing blood. Father Gabriel cried, "Do not fight its grip, it thrives on struggle." Karen whispered, "It is rewriting her body." The note deepened, vibrating through floorboards, rattling glass until a picture frame crashed down. The air smelled of scorched hair and iron, pressing hard into their lungs. The violin tore itself from the table, landing in Emma Val's lap with violent force. She gasped, "It wants me to play." Lucas Reed lunged to pull it away, but the bow slashed his shoulder. Father Gabriel Moore raised his voice, shouting, "Renounce its name." Emma shook her head, trembling, saying, "It knows my blood." Karen Holt muttered, "This is possession, not performance." The bow struck hard, releasing a chord so loud the windows cracked. Emma screamed, "Stop!" but her fingers moved against her will, pressing strings. Lucas shouted, "Fight it!" Father Gabriel collapsed to his knees, eyes wide. Karen's face blanched as she said, It is not the violin anymore, it is her. The cord hung in the air, pulsing like a heart, refusing to fade. Emma Vale's voice merged with the violin, every note a scream half human, half metallic. Lucas Reed shouted, "Let her go!" The hairstrings dug into Emma's skin, drawing thin, red lines. Father Gabriel Moore clutched his rosary and pressed it against the wood, whispering, "Spirit of the damned, be still." The violin shrieked louder, flinging him back against the wall. Karen Holt said, "It rejects sanctity." Emma's eyes glowed faint in the stormlight, as her lips mouthed the same chant the violin had sung since her mother's death. Lucas cried, "You are stronger than it." She stared through him, voice echoing like 100 whispers. The bow cracked down once more, a sharp scream that rattled nails from the beams above. Lucas Reed seized Emma Val's shoulders, shaking her heart. He shouted, "You are not it." She gasped once, the chant breaking. Then the violin screamed louder to reclaim her. Father Gabriel Moore crawled forward, voice raw, saying, "Sacrifice must break it." Emma collapsed to her knees, the strings tightening like noose wire around her arms. Karen Holt stepped closer, trembling, whispering, "If it wants blood, it already has enough." Lucas cried, "We destroy it." He raised the broken shears again, striking against the neck. The violin wailed, splitting wood but reforming instantly. Emma shrieked, "It cannot be broken, it only remakes itself." Father Gabriel groaned, saying, "It is endless." The room darkened, as if the storm moved inside the walls, smothering every breath. The bow rose for its final strike, strings snapping like whips in the dark. Emma Vale lifted her head, whispering, "It only wants me." Lucas Reed screamed, "No," but she pulled free of his grasp, pressing her hands onto the strings. Father Gabriel Moore cried, "Child, do not." Karen Holt shouted, "She will be consumed." Emma said, "Then it ends with me." She pressed down until blood ran along the neck of the violin. The note that followed roared like thunder, shaking the foundation. Lucas fell back, covering his ears, screaming her name. Father Gabriel dropped the rosary, staring in grief. Karen collapsed against the wall, pale with horror. The violin screamed once more, then fell silent, its glow extinguished, leaving Emma trembling, face drained of color. Silence held after the last scream, a silence thick as wet wool. Emma Vale sagged over the dead violin, hands slick and shaking. Lucas Reed said, "You are here, stay here." Father Gabriel Moore rose slowly, breathing like a bellows. He said, "A price was paid." Karen Holt stared at the black wood, whispering, "The meters read nothing." Rain weakened to a hush that sounded almost kind. Emma looked at the strings, now dull as thread cut from a shroud. She said, "It stopped, but not by mercy." Lucas wrapped her hands and would not let go. The house relaxed one board at a time, as if remembering how to stand. They gathered broken tools and glass, as if tidying a wake. Lucas Reed said, "Hospital." Emma Vale shook her head and said, "Not yet." Father Gabriel Moore traced a cross into the spilled salt and closed his eyes. He said, "The condemned wanted a witness." Karen Holt checked ruined cables and swallowed pride. She said, "I recorded enough to be afraid." The violin lay inert, but the room remembered its hum. Emma whispered to the case, "You will not travel." Lucas set the lid and did not lock it, as if locks had ever mattered here. Father Gabriel Moore spoke of burial, but not of ground. He said, "The sea keeps secrets that earth returns." Emma Vale stared at her reflection in the varnish, and did not answer. Lucas Reed said, "I will carry it." Karen Holt shook her head, voice thin. She said, "Protocol says archive." Emma lifted the bow, now lifeless, and laid it across the bridge. She said, "It ends as it rests." The lamp flickered once, only a tired bulb, yet everyone looked up. The house felt lighter, but only by a breath. They drove to the harbor while clouds broke into pale seams. Father Gabriel Moore said, Salt remembers nothing. Emma Vale held the case on her knees, knuckles white. Lucas Reed drove without music, eyes on the water as gulls lifted and fell. Karen Holt checked the dead recorder and left it off. She said, "Let the ocean measure it." Waves spoke in a tongue older than prayer and kinder than proof. Emma breathed with the tide and did not look back at land. The day thinned to a clean, colorless edge. At the pier's end, they lowered the case into black water and waited. Father Gabriel Moore said, "Rest where no hand will tune you." Lucas Reed squeezed Emma Val's shoulder, steady and silent. Karen Holt whispered, "Document closed," but did not write it. The case sank, and the ripples smoothed to glass. Emma said, "Do not follow." The sea kept its answer. That night the parlor stood empty, and at 3 a.m. the lamp flicked on by itself. The violin was gone, yet the bow tapped once from inside the walls and went still.